Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the one true Brainiac in the modern era, the Collector of Worlds, is one of the hosts of the UNBOUND podcast, first-time guest, Logan Crowley. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Anthony. This is really cool. You were number one on my Spotify Wrapped, so this is a neat opportunity.
Well, I'm honored. We've been messaging over the years. You've been an audience member and a patron. I appreciate all of the support. And I know there have been a bunch of times you've submitted questions or comments for episodes, always really interesting and thoughtful. So I'm happy to have you here and to connect in this way. And I mentioned you host the UNBOUND podcast with your wife. And of course, people hear the ads for the podcast on Digging for Kryptonite. Yep. But now that you're here, what do you want to share with folks about it?
Well, you had a very important role to play in that podcast because I was not even thinking about having a podcast until I accidentally subscribed to a tier of your Patreon that got me an ad for a podcast.
Is that really what got it going?
That it was a combination of that and a pep talk from Case Aiken. Because I always felt I have a Southern accent, and not everybody loves that. So I had always felt like, well, microphone probably isn't for me. Nobody wants to hear what Conway Twitty thinks about comic books. But when I realized that I had that tier paid, I was like, well, hell, I'm getting it anyway. I own a microphone. I might as well give it a shot. And we are on hiatus right now because my wife is pregnant. Our first boy is due in May, and she is the member of the relationship that knows which end of a computer to hold. So she's got so that's got the show kind of held up for a minute while we're going through all that. But we will be back. The elevator pitch for the show is we review comic book stories that can be completely contained in one issue. So it's essentially a read-along podcast. We always announce what we're going to do ahead of time, but the barrier for entry is very low.
I'm so glad that you and your wife are doing that. Congratulations on the impending addition to your family. We look forward to episodes coming back around. So we're here to talk about this one true Brainiac, introduced in the Action Comic storyline Brainiac in 2008 from Action 866 through 870 by JOHNS and Gary Frank. We have hit on this arc so many times over the years on this podcast. We talked about it when we did our Donnerverse event years ago. We talked about it when we did New Krypton. We talked about it, of course, when we did our big JOHNS coverage just a few months ago. So this is something that we keep coming back to. We'll get into the specifics of it, but this run, but even more specifically, that Brainiac arc, when did you first encounter it, and what kind of spot has it occupied in your fandom, particularly as it relates to Brainiac?
So I read it off the shelf. I was initially very negative on that whole Superman run as a kid. I mean, I was in 7th grade when that comic was coming out.
Boy, I feel old.
Worked okay. My dad worked in a comic shop in Dalton, Georgia called the Fantasy Factory throughout my childhood. He alternated between working in the shop when he was in town, and then he was a traveling professional wrestler. And so I spent more time in there than I spent at home. And Superman was my favorite superhero. And Geoff Johns, at that time, was damn near a deity to me because I got into his comics with JSA and then Flash and then Green Lantern. So when they announced that he was going to be on Superman, I was ecstatic, but it was not. I have come to like it over time, but at that time, the only part of it I liked was Secret Origin. I was furious at the end of Brainiac when Jonathan Kent died, just absolutely apoplectic, and I was already furious about Chris Kent going back into the Phantom Zone. I felt like that was such a it felt like a slap in the face for Superman to end a story not able to rescue that little boy. So when Jonathan Kent died, I quit reading Superman. So Brainiac, I don't know that I've ever had a bigger swing around on a comic than this one. I didn't pick it back up till the New 52.
Interesting.
Yeah, but over time, I have come to appreciate it more. I've gotten less sensitive about the Kents being. I still don't like it, but I've gotten less sensitive about the Kents being cut out. I do still have some gripes with it. It does feel at times too almost truncated and simple. The idea of a Brainiac story basically being a big fist fight is so weirdly antithetical to me. But you cannot question that the art is incredible. This is the most cohesive version of Brainiac there's ever been. And if I was going to give anybody one Brainiac book, it is this one.
Agreed. It's funny. I mean, I guess our experiences aren't entirely dissimilar. And I know I've talked about this before, so I won't belabor the point. But my reaction to that post Infinite Crisis period of the Superman books, particularly this Geoff Johns run, has definitely shifted a lot over the years. At the time, I bumped up against it, I think for two reasons. One, I had made the decision to switch from single issues to trades, and I don't regret that decision, but it meant that I wasn't as dialed into the books as they were coming out the way I had been before. And I think that impacted my enjoyment to some degree. But more importantly, this period saw the infusion of a number of pre-crisis elements back into the books. And for this child of the Triangle era, it was a little jarring at the time. Now that I've taken this long view and I've gotten a lot more experience with those pre-crisis stories and elements, I appreciate the post-Infinite Crisis landscape a lot more. And in fact, I look at that relatively short 5-year period and it's like, oh man, it's actually kind of a sweet spot in Superman history where the version I grew up with was still there. That was still the basis. But then we had these additions from the wider mythology. So I've come around on it a lot. And I agree with you that if I were to give somebody a single Brainiac story to read, it would be this one. So this is a story where we find out that Superman had actually never encountered the true Brainiac before. He had only ever encountered Brainiac's programming in the form of probes. Milton Fine was infected by a cloud of nanites. It was never the actual Brainiac. The true Brainiac is this ancient green-skinned Kaluan with cybernetic enhancements who lives in his bioshell, aka the Skull Ship, and bottles cities from worlds that he then destroys so that he can be the sole possessor of their knowledge. He is this collector of worlds, and he's the abductor of Kandor. And what I appreciate now, after this whole journey going through Brainiac specifically, that I don't think I totally appreciated before, is how much Geoff Johns was able to synthesize as far as Brainiac lore. The green-skinned Kaluan and the bottling of Kandor come straight out of the Silver Age. He even works in Coco. It's not a cute monkey-like buddy in this one. It's more of a ferocious beast, but still that's there. The Skull Ship, right? That iconic late Bronze Age imagery, that's there. And the motive, the fact that Brainiac has a motivation here to be the sole possessor of this knowledge. I have to imagine Superman the Animated Series was an influence there. But I think that was one of the things that struck me this time around, because I think I always took for granted that Brainiac had more of a motivation, particularly in the pre-crisis stories. But now that I've gone back and I've looked at them, for the most part, it largely was revenge and conquest. So I think Johns was able to tie so much together from virtually every iteration without even wiping away Milton Fine. Milton Fine is still accounted for. Right. So I appreciate this now more than ever. And this has been an ongoing question in these episodes, like the best version of Brainiac. And while I get the arguments for the Kryptonian AI, and there's a lot to be said for that, this ultimately is the sweet spot for me.
I don't know. I think my ideal, you asked in the first episode, and I might be jumping ahead of you, but you asked the guest in the first episode of the series what their favorite Brainiac is. And I really think mine's probably Brainiac 13.
Oh, okay.
I really didn't like, this is going back to elementary school. My first exposure to Brainiac was the Super Friends and then the Superman the Animated Series. And I've come to like the animated series version more, but I really didn't like either of them as a small child. I felt like Brainiac was a villain that Superman often just kind of ran through. Even though he shouldn't. Brainiac 13 changed all that when I read Y2K and Our World's at War, I guess I was in the 5th grade. Like I 180'd immediately. I realized, oh, this is how big a threat this guy ought to be. But the more I have thought, so that was going to be my answer. But I really do think that this version, exactly like you said, is the one that really you should try to hone in on if you're a writer who wants to take a Brainiac story going forward, because this is the only version of Brainiac that doesn't cut you off from something. Every other version of Brainiac leaves a portion of the pie that you don't get by his nature, and this is the one where you can do any Brainiac you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny because we've talked about the work of Geoff Johns a lot over the years, and what Johns does here, this whole idea that none of the Brainiacs you saw before were the actual Brainiac. This is the real Brainiac. It's not miles apart from other character revisions we've seen from him, the way he was able to clean up Hawkman continuity, reincarnation, all these other versions were reincarnated versions. Like, okay, literally the issue before this Brainiac storyline, I complained about this a few months ago, was the Toyman issue. That was where we found out that, oh, the Toyman who had killed Cat Grant's son, Adam, in the Triangle era was essentially one of these robots that Toyman had created. It's like, okay. Now, looking at those issues back to back, you might say, oh, okay, we're going to this well back to back a little bit much.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, in the vacuum of the Brainiac story, I think this works well and is a genuinely compelling take. And as far as why I think Brainiac as the Coluan works best, as opposed to having his origins be on Krypton, one of the things that I love about this story, and you see it right from the jump, because the story opens with a flashback to the bottling of Kandor and Zod and Ursa's failed attempts to stop this, and the horror on the streets of Kandor, is that Krypton is alien to us, to Earth, to the inhabitants of the DC universe, but Brainiac is alien to Krypton. And that's a whole other dynamic to play. And we get deeper into the story there. And there's a moment where Superman, I think maybe he's asking for the location of Kandor or something like that, but he asks Brainiac a question and he punctuates it with alien. He's like, where'd you put it? Alien. But just that whole idea of Brainiac and Kolu being alien to Krypton, just as Krypton's alien to Earth, I think that's an interesting angle, and the Zod of it all. I talked about this last week. I feel like Brainiac being from Krypton almost inherently takes something away from Zod as a distinct villain. And so not only do you avoid that with this, but now you also create this whole other dynamic of Zod versus Brainiac. So I feel like there's so much more that can be mined from something like this.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, and maybe not my favorite Superman villain, but damn near. The Eradicator is basically removed from the board if you make Brainiac from Krypton. He becomes entirely superfluous. Whereas if you go with the Coluan version, you end up with both of them as viable characters who you can tell interesting stories with. I think my favorite, it's not my favorite Brainiac in total. We're going to talk about it today, but I think my favorite Brainiac origin is probably the New 52, the first version that Morrison comes up with. But, on this world, on Kolu, they called me Computo. On, Krypton, it was Brainiac. And now on Earth, you call me Internet. I think that idea that Brainiac is just intelligence itself, I think that's probably closest to what Otto Bender had in mind for him. If you look at not the stories where he's stealing aluminum siding, but other of the first Brainiac stories, the inhumanity of him, I think, is what really is at the core of the character. And I think it creates an interesting juxtaposition we see in this and in other Lex Luthor Brainiac stories where Lex Luthor is kind of all of human failings combined into one capable character. He's petty, he's greedy, he's selfish, he's wrathful. Brainiac is all of the inhuman evils and that dichotomy, I think, is what makes him Superman's 1A nemesis, right? Of Superman is, as James Gunn has just emphatically reminded us, the most human you can possibly be while not technically being human. So to have Brainiac, who is the most inhuman, I do think I get a little more mileage out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you were articulating there is an echo of what Supergirl says in the Brainiac storyline, and is something that JOHNS had said in interviews at the time about if Lex represents the worst of humans, Brainiac represents the worst of aliens out there as well. So I like that parallel between the two of them. And like you said, that contrast between Superman's humanity and the inhumanity of Brainiac. There's also an interesting angle here. And I guess it's the sort of thing, it only really works in the first Brainiac story like it does here. But the whole idea of Brainiac being this ancient being, right? Like there's a specific point about how he hasn't awoken in centuries and he hasn't left the bioshell in even longer. And that will play into his defeat when Superman's able to remove him from the ship and literally bring him down to earth in the mud and all these bugs crawling all over him and everything. And he can't deal with it. But that whole idea of him being this more ancient being, I thought that was an interesting angle too. In the present day, the kickoff bit of action here is one of Brainiac's probes lands on Earth, and Superman contends with him and subdues him rather easily. And as far as Superman knows, that is Brainiac until he has this conversation with Supergirl where she's like, no, that's not Brainiac. You've never met the real Brainiac. But that probe was able to send a signal to the Skull ship. And this introduces the idea that Brainiac has been searching for this Kryptonian, but has never been able to get a lock on him. Like, even though apparently his programming had controlled Milton Fine, who was the Brainiac for a whole period of time, he was never able to convey the location or the coordinates to the Skull ship, which is a bit of a stretch. And I don't know if this will make it better or worse for people, but it's not dissimilar from what we saw in Zack Snyder's Justice League. This whole idea that like Darkseid had been to Earth and then he got defeated and he could never find it again.
Well, the timeline makes sense if you think about it, because gas prices got really high in the 70s. And then the Brainiac story is like right around the time we started fracking. So it was right then he could afford to get that big old ship across the universe to.
Yeah. But, and also I think this story in particular, I agree with you. It is a relatively short, straightforward, simple story. It's only 5 issues. We don't get the divisive narration that I'm always looking for. It's a relatively brisk read, but I feel like it's effective in laying the foundation for this version of Brainiac that, with limited exception, like My Adventures with Superman, where they went back to the Kryptonian AI angle. I mean, this is the version of Brainiac that has persisted more or less ever since. And so I think the bones of it here are incredibly solid. And I love what this brings out in Supergirl's character as well, right? Because she lived through the abduction of Kandor and the stories that were told about it, right? And the fear and the threat that Brainiac represented on Krypton. And that further illustrated this difference between Supergirl and Superman, the fact that he had grown up on Earth and he didn't have those memories and that attachment. And the Superman Unbound animated adaptation really leaned into that even more and really made it much more of Supergirl's story, yeah?
Yeah, I do have some quibbles with that movie. Superman's weird Adrian Brody face is chief amongst them, but not necessarily a fair complaint. More of a complaint is that they insert this weird story where Superman and Lois are involved, but she doesn't know that he's Clark, which is not in the original text. Very unnecessary. It does, though, have, I think, Jonathan Noble as Brainiac in that movie is my favorite portrayal of Brainiac in any media outside of the comics. I think his voice is pitch perfect.
Yeah. Oh, the voice cast for that is great. I mean, you have Matt Bomer as Superman and Stana Katic from Castle as Lois, Molly Quinn from Castle as Supergirl. The Castle fans, I guess. No, I think it was Warner Brothers, so it was all in the family there. But yeah, so that animated adaptation called Superman Unbound came out in 2013, so 5 years after the comic book storyline. A while back, I was on our mutual friend Perry Constantine's show, Superhero Cinephiles. We did a whole episode on it. But I rewatched it again last night in advance of this. And yeah, the designs and the animation style are far from my favorite. The title is so curious to me. I have to imagine that after Superman Brainiac attacks, they were really averse to using Brainiac in the title, but they went with something as generic as it gets, like Superman Unbound. So that's kind of unfortunate. But yeah, great voice cast. So to your point, one of the major hurdles that I had with the original comic book storyline back in the day was the fact that it culminated in the death of Jonathan Kent. And as I've talked about so many times, I prefer the version where the Kents live. And I really had a hard time with that over time. And especially since we've gone through different permutations in the comics of one or both of the Kents being alive or dead in the time since, I'm able to look at that Brainiac storyline more in a vacuum. And I can appreciate the tragic poetry of Superman restoring candor and getting this connection to his homeworld back at the exact same moment that he's losing such a huge piece of his earthly side. So I've made my peace with that. But at the time, I felt similar to you. But on the note of the movie, they don't go down that road. Pa is in the movie for a second. He's sleeping and snoring in his lounge chair. Martha's there. She has a nice moment with Supergirl when she's kind of figuring out which direction to go in. But yeah, they don't go down this road of Jonathan dying. Thematically, their substitution, the replacement they make is Lois and Clark in this kind of nebulous period of their relationship in the animated movie where they are together. She knows that Clark is Superman, but at Clark's insistence, they've kept the relationship a secret because he's worried. What if someone finds out that Clark is Superman? She'll be in danger. Obviously, that's a departure from the storyline that it's adapting. And it is, I don't know, maybe somewhat of an unusual track to take. But I guess ultimately the idea is Clark is trying to bottle their relationship. Right. And then all of this business with Brainiac, you can't bottle life. Life is complicated, you know. And so he has this moment of realization. And by the end of the movie, he kisses Lois in the bullpen in front of everybody and proposes marriage. And that's the note that we end on in the film. It's one of those things where I look at that and I say, it's a fine substitution, but not a necessary one and not a better one, you know. But I'm curious as to why they went down that road.
It's funny because, like I said, I did have such a strong reaction to the Jonathan Kent death originally, but years later, and frankly, just a couple more Jonathan Kent deaths landed pretty hard between here and then. And however I felt about this story after watching Jonathan Kent get killed by an evil Mixelplick or sucked into a tornado, I did begin to appreciate this one more. I felt like it was, by the time I got to Unbound, I was like, oh man, I wish they'd killed Jonathan Kent in this, you know, because I think the best parts of Unbound to me are that beautiful shot of Clark crying in the barn holding the horseshoe that ends the Brainiac story. It is such a hit in the gut. And frankly, there's a zillion different ways to bring Jonathan Kent back. And I think as a seventh grader, I was like, oh, now he's dead forever, you know, and I've realized now, I was like, he's dead for a minute. He'll heat back up. You just got to pop him in the microwave for a second.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing. I think this animated adaptation, for anyone who's never watched it or if it's not top of mind, it's pretty faithful otherwise to the comic book storyline. It follows most of the same beats as far as Superman contending with the probe and then learning about the true nature of Brainiac and taking the fight to Brainiac and getting captured and escaping and saving Kandor and then Metropolis being bottled and then rescued. It follows those beats. It definitely makes it much more of Supergirl's story. And the movie, I think wisely puts Supergirl in the flashbacks kind of in the middle of the action when Kandor is being bottled. Like she's fleeing the city with her family. I guess maybe timing-wise that wouldn't have necessarily worked in the comic book context. But I think if we're really trying to drive home, like she's so afraid of Brainiac, I think that flashback to her kind of being present for the bottling of Kandor, I think does help make the point a little bit better. So I think that was a change for the film that worked. Obviously, yeah, we didn't have the business with Pa dying. We focused more on the Lois and Clark relationship side. I would say the biggest change otherwise in the movie that stood out to me was the fact that Superman actually goes into the bottle city of Kandor after he's been captured, which is something we don't get in the comic book. Now, in the comic, he finds the bottle city of Kandor, and while he is outside the bottle, he has this conversation with Zor-El and Allura. So it accomplishes a lot of the same things. And I get, for the comic, they knew they were building towards this new Krypton storyline where Kandor is going to be enlarged, and now it's going to be on Earth initially, and then in orbit next to Earth, and we're going to have all of this conflict, and he's going to be interacting and then living on New Krypton. So maybe they felt like we didn't need to actually go into Kandor at that point. But since the movie wasn't going to get into that, I'm glad that they put him in the bottle. And not only did they do that in the film, but they introduced this really interesting angle that I think is pretty distinct to this movie, which is the fact that Brainiac is monitoring all of these conversations in the bottle city for subversive discussions. And whenever there's talk about escaping or overthrowing Brainiac, these automatons show up to shut that down. So the people have really taken to not having those kinds of conversations. It's living in a bit of a police state, not entirely too far removed from what's going on in the real world. But I was just very struck by that angle that the movie took. I thought that was interesting.
And it's going to be funny for me to say that something that's really happening, I feel like, is too evil for Brainiac. But that actually was a change that I didn't love because I like when Brainiac is trying to keep when his core goal is this like informational preservation, right? And I feel like something like that, like my platonic ideal Brainiac, if he found out that another Brainiac was sending in goons to break up a conversation, he'd go, "Oh, you're interfering with the culture." That was one. That's something that I would prefer. I like a little more self-confidence in my Brainiac.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But circling back to the Brainiac comic book arc in particular, and just this take on Brainiac and the motive, I just want to hit on this one more time, because in going back through those Bronze Age stories, the late Bronze Age, when we got the Rebirth and the robotic redesign, we talked about this, but there was this aspect that Brainiac's disembodied consciousness before he created his new robot body was traveling from world to world and acquiring knowledge. I don't know to what extent Johns was drawing or extrapolating from that versus more so the animated series. I have to imagine the animated series was the more dominant influence. But at the same time, I wonder, had that Bronze Age iteration been allowed to play out for longer, it was so close to Crisis. I know I keep saying that, but it was just like, it was such a short amount of time. I wonder if that had played out, if we would have gotten to something at least close to the idea of this collector of worlds, acquirer of information, because it just felt like some of those seeds were there. But then obviously by the time you get to the animated series, you're getting Brainiac compiling all of the knowledge of these worlds and these orbs.
I love that. I listened to that part of the episode today. I love the skeletal Brainiac. He's almost perfect Brainiac. The only problem with that Brainiac is he is in so few stories, and they all share the kind of Bronze Age, I'm going to say apathetic writing style that I feel like was rampant in the Superman comics at that time, where it felt like even the best ideas were like a 70% effort. They were just like, this is the Superman comic this month, and that's what infests that Brainiac. But I think if you look at the Brainiacs that follow, the Skull Ship stays, the collector aspect stays, the inhumanity stays, and that fearsome presence that version has on the page immediately, that even before that, Brainiac was powerful enough to oppose Superman, but it was really the force field. He couldn't get to him. That's the first Brainiac that I remember him he just grabs Superman and throws him down the stairs. And you go, geez Louise, we're dealing with a whole different kind of bad guy now. And I love the look so much. But there's just not where it loses out to this Brainiac and Brainiac 13 for me is there's not a book where I'd go, here, this is the one. Read it if you want to know about Brainiac, like there is with Y2K in this, and it suffers for that.
Yeah, you use the word fearsome, and I think that's a key aspect of the Brainiac that we get here. There is a horror to what he inflicts upon Krypton. That attack on the city as the robotic probes are killing those they deem redundant, and then forming this barrier and creating the shield. And we see this not just in this story, but in so many of the stories across media before and since. But the imagery of Kandor or Metropolis or any other city being bottled with that skull ship floating above, there is something so iconic and effective about that imagery. It's just so striking. So the horror aspect from the perspective of the Kryptonians, and then on the ship, there's that great moment, and the animated movie plays with this as well, where Brainiac awakens and stands to face Superman, just like towering over him. So even though, yes, there's this intellectual side, there's also a physicality to this version of Brainiac that I think is very effective as well.
Which I think is necessary. I think, like I said, I've just about completely 180'd on the animated series Superman as an adult. But I think what I missed as a kid is Superman on that show. Superman runs through Brainiac drones like sugar glass. I mean, just dozens of them at a time. And so you never really feel like at some point this guy's going to run out of robots. Yeah, and Superman's basically going to be fine. I think that is what this version, like I said, Brainiac 13, the skull, that's what you have to have that, I think, for Brainiac to really, really get that horror home.
This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. I talk about Smallville a lot, but when it comes to listening, one podcast is at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode. And while their series rewatch has concluded, the podcast continues with more great Smallville and Superman talk. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows on the Always Hold On To network. Ever wonder what would happen if a person who knew barely anything about comics decided to absorb hundreds of Superman stories from all eras and media? That's exactly what Robbo is doing on This Podcast Will Never Die, which starts with all the ways the Man of Steel stood out on the newsstands in 1938. Listen and subscribe to This Podcast Will Never Die, and you'll never look at Superman's trunks the same way again. I do love when we get to the point of this slugfest between Superman and Brainiac. And I think Brainiac calls him a brute or something to that effect. And Superman's like, when I need to be. And, what really galvanizes Superman is Brainiac is so dismissive of Earth and what could be gleaned from the planet. And that really spurs Superman to action, which I thought was effective. I liked that side of things. One of the aspects of this story, and I've complained about it so many times, is this idea that, well, generally I don't mind the idea that Brainiac is destroying the planets he leaves behind, right? And kind of going back to the horror of it, I think one of the other things that works so well about this Brainiac, and the animated series one as well, is like, it's incredibly cold and cruel, but there is a logic to what Brainiac is saying. If your purpose is the acquisition, the collection of the knowledge of the universe, world by world, well, if the world continues after your acquisition of the knowledge, well, then this all falls apart. It has to be that there's no more knowledge to be developed at that point. So there is a cold logic to it that I think adds to the fearsomeness. And so we see Brainiac destroying the planets after he bottles a city by firing the solar instigator into the sun, which causes it to go supernova. This then raises the question, was Brainiac responsible for the destruction of Krypton? And Superman asks that question. And unless maybe your reading of it is different, but I mean, I feel like the story never gives us an explicit answer. They pose the question more than answer it. And that little bit of ambiguity is fine for me to live in. Cause I don't really love the idea of Brainiac being the one responsible.
If I had a genie wish, you would know, because suddenly there would be no more stories trying to stick some lumpy alien into the middle of Krypton to explain why Krypton exploded. The idea that someone could look at the beauty of that Krypton was ultimately destroyed because of the apathy of a spoiled population, to see that story and think, you know what would be better than that though? It's Rogol Zar. I don't understand, and Brainiac frankly doesn't measure up either. The only version of that I really still like is on the animated series, where they perfectly intertwined Brainiac being symptomatic of that spoiled apathy, that he's part of, well, we've invented this machine, we don't have to think hard. I think that is the best version that there could be.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And there are other iterations here, and I'm blanking off the top of my head, where it's said that Brainiac didn't need to destroy Krypton because he recognized that it was in its final days anyway. Its days were numbered. And I feel like that's a fair balance, because it does get a little bit tricky, right? If his MO is that he's destroying planets, well, why wouldn't he have destroyed Krypton? But I think the answer that, he knew it was on its way out anyway, he didn't need to bother, I think that works just fine. And so I'm okay with that. One other thing that we've been talking about that I've come to realize is important to me is Brainiac being Coluan in origin, and having started as a person, as an organic being, and then he's become this, even if then he transfers his consciousness to a robotic body or other probes or what have you, that there's kind of that basis. What's interesting though with this Brainiac storyline is, like, we don't get the backstory of him we know that he's from Colu, but it's not like we kind of see his life before. We'll see other stories here that we're going to talk about that flesh that out more.
I was about to say, you're right. I always in my head put Superman 23.2 into the Brainiac comic, and even this time I read them back to back. So but I've been doing that for years. You're right. I forget that we don't actually get that backstory of him. Though, and I made the argument for Brainiac being inhuman earlier, but I'm gonna make the argument now for why I think that him starting as a person, you're right, there is something really neat to mine there too, because what is Brainiac if not the idea that something's going to come treat us like we treat things, right? I mean, we have a storied history of going to new places, taking the stuff we think is cool, putting it under glass where we can look at it, and then leaving everything behind it in ruins. And that is Brainiac's MO, right? He's taking cities and not oil, but really, what's the difference,
Yeah. And I think I don't know, it's kind of an open question, even for me, when we talk about Brainiac's backstory, like, well, assuming that there's value in having him start off as this Coluan person, then we've seen it spun in different ways here about how much tragedy is there in his backstory, and is it more or less effective when tragedy morphed him into what he becomes? I mean, I don't know. I think there are different ways to look at it, and we'll get into some of them here. But yeah, you don't really have that at this initial point here. Like I said, I think this is really giving us the foundation. I have to imagine this would be one of those stories that James Gunn would be looking at in terms of formulating his Brainiac.
I will bet you a stale mailed Snickers bar that scene you were talking about earlier with Kara running from the drones is in Man of Tomorrow, frame for frame.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. Before we kind of move forward, wrap up the post Infinite Crisis era, and then beyond, anything else you want to say about that Brainiac arc specifically?
No, I think that is a solid. I think that a lot of times comic book fans with a deep bench of comics to read tend to undervalue how great it is to have one story that brings you into a character. And as much as I would love, if somebody was like, I like Brainiac, as much as I would love to be like, awesome, here's, I don't know, the Insiders arc from Teen Titans or whatever, like there is, I think, while I probably give the story a B+ overall, and B+ is a good grade. I'm, C's get degrees, but but what makes it so valuable is you really can just give it to anybody. And it's kind of like the Secret Origins story that way. When you're done reading this book, you're good to go on Brainiac. Whatever is going to get thrown at you, you're going to have the tools to go, okay, I know what this is. I can figure it out from here.
Yeah. I mean, this checks off, I think, all of the essential ingredients I've been talking about in these episodes. The connection to Krypton, the cold, calculating nature, the motivation for why he does what he does, the Coluan origin, the skull ship, all of that, I think, is at work here. And so I think it's tremendously effective. It's not that I say this begrudgingly. I just feel like it's kind of an obvious one to zero in on, but I think for a reason. I think it does all of those things that we're talking about here. Like I said, the post Infinite Crisis era doesn't last all that long, and it's already 2008 when this storyline hits. I did just want to mention more as a footnote. After the Brainiac arc, there's the Boy of Steel storyline in Adventure Comics by JOHNS and Manipul, and the subplot there is that Lex and Brainiac have teamed up to escape military custody. There's this bit about Project Alien Farm, where it's never spelled out explicitly, but the implication seems to be that Lex is working on a clone that combines his DNA, because he mentions it being family, with Coluan DNA, because we see a green hand. And to my knowledge, this has never been followed up on or explained anywhere. If anyone knows anything otherwise, please let me know. But I just bring it up because it's like, that's out there.
Anthony, the answer to what it is obvious. That was the lab where they grew ignition. And then they sent him back in time.
Maybe that's the thing we need to, maybe that's like any of these lost threads and characters like Ignition, like Project Alien Farm. Maybe they're all part of the same thing, but I did just want to mention that. And then of course, this leads into the new Krypton storyline, and we've covered a couple episodes on it years ago. So we have the return of Brainiac and the defeat of Brainiac at the climax, or near the climax of the new Krypton saga. And that basically takes us to the end of this post-Infinite Crisis landscape. And then we have the New 52. And the New 52 iteration of Brainiac is introduced in Grant Morrison's first arc in Action Comics. And this Brainiac visually looks like a caterpillar, right? I think that's an accurate description. His influence and presence is felt before we actually see him. He's able to commandeer machinery on Earth, the Terminauts, who announce that they are the voice of the colony of the Collector of Worlds, and they're there to preserve significant artifacts. And Metropolis gets bottled, and we have Superman make what seemingly is an impossible leap into space, into Brainiac's ship and all that. And that's when we see this caterpillar version of Brainiac. And he's also been able to commandeer the Metallotech. So he's also speaking through John Corbin. I welcome any thoughts you have, but my main question for you, because we also looked at Superman number 23.2 from about a year later here, which was not a Grant Morrison issue, but that gave us the origin of the New 52 Brainiac, right? I feel like there was a shift that happened between the Morrison arc and then Superman 23.2, where with the latter of which I feel really kind of recentered us back on the Geoff Johns iteration. I feel like what Morrison was intending was more of a fully robotic / AI depiction of the character. Do you share that? Like, what's your impression of that?
Yeah, I think that 23.2 is the product of Geoff Johns alone with an editor and a bat. Like, that's how it reads. I know. You said the caterpillar body for Brainiac. He does take that form, but I really read this Brainiac as more of of not having a body, because he assembles that caterpillar is mushed together from stuff that's lying around like he just kind of sucks Metallo up into him.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I think is the most interesting about. I really love. Let me just stop a minute because I love the Morrison New 52 arc. It's a top 5 Superman run for me. It is. The only problem with this comic is the comics that follow it. Like,
sure.
But to me, and this Brainiac, I love it because I think one of the most important things in Brainiac's first appearance is that he just, because of his force field and his ship, he just absolutely puts Superman on his heels in a way that I can't know for sure because I, didn't come down the pipe until the 90s. But I feel like from reading a bunch of Golden Age Superman comics, I don't think they'd ever seen Superman put on his heels like that. Like he was. I mean, in that first Brainiac comic, he flies away, and the people in the bottle are like, he just ditched us. And that kind of happens in this. It's such a powerful moment. And I feel like the Morrison Brainiac, while I don't like, the only thing I don't like about it is that caterpillar. If he had formed into something more like the Marv Wolfman Brainiac, I would have come in saying, this is my favorite Brainiac story. This is my favorite version of Brainiac. Unfortunately, I don't think that design really holds up. However, outside of that, he is powerful enough to physically give Superman a run for his money, and Superman doesn't physically have a way to beat this Brainiac. And I think that makes him such a fascinating. I mean, you can't punch information, it becomes Superman versus the creeping idea of science, and that's a very interesting thing for the Man of Tomorrow to be facing.
Yeah. I mean, right. And ultimately he is able to prevail through the use of his miniaturized rocket that brought him to Earth. He shoots it into Brainiac's head and it allows him to reprogram Brainiac. And then in a very interesting turn, he ends up using Brainiac's ship as his Fortress of Solitude, which is interesting. And honestly, just the use of Brainiac, and he's not the sole villain, right? Lex is there in this first arc as well. Metallo is there, but inserting Brainiac into a quote unquote first Superman story, very welcome and refreshing. I think, because we've been talking about how like all these movie iterations, like they all save Brainiac, but it's like, no, like you can actually do Brainiac from the jump.
Oh, he's I mean, you want something big for Superman's debut, and he's a perfect version of that. And something that I love in this Men of Steel story is Lex Luthor and Brainiac are trying to save humanity, right? I think that's such an amazing place for the villains to be, because Superman and them are ultimately disagreeing against irrational safety measures, which is a very real power play. Again, it gets into human fears writ large, as Kevin Smith would say. And I love that so much about it. Lex Luthor has lured Brainiac to Earth to save Earth. And I think that's brilliant. And I don't think it at all jives with 23.2 because Brainiac didn't notice that Superman was living in one of his ships. He didn't. I guess you can't unplug and plug a Brainiac drone back in to get that Superman reprogramming out of it for however many years. I don't think it jives at all with this Brainiac that they bring back.
Fair. Well, what I will say, that one thing that is consistent more or less in the Morrison arc and then in 23.2 is, like you were saying, this idea of Brainiac on its face there to save Earth. So Brainiac has identified this threat, the Multitude, which we'll come to find out this is part of the Vindictivix multi-pronged, multi-dimensional attack. But Brainiac has foresaw this, and so he is here to preserve a portion of the Earth before the rest of it is destroyed, which is, I don't know, kind of an interesting angle. And also, I think the thing I like about it is that I like when there's a reason why Brainiac is going to specific planets. Arguably, you don't need that, right? If ultimately his end game is to be all there is and to be the sole repository of everything, in theory, he'll go world to world until there's nothing left. You don't really
Right.
need him to be following a map. But I don't know. I like the idea of, okay, no, he's identified these worlds that are going to be targets of the multitude, and that's why he's targeting them. I like kind of putting a little bit behind that.
Well, yeah, and it creates such a perfect struggle for him and Superman. I I think villains are always more compelling when you can kind of see where they're coming from, and there are very real forces in our world that go, uh, we have billionaires right now. They're like, we need to take 11 people and run off and leave everybody else. It's the only way for humanity to survive. Uh, Turning Brainiac into that sort of colonial urge without making it 100% malevolent, I think just gives you so much more room to play and puts Superman in such a more interesting decision, because now it makes, what is the thing that makes Superman's plan different? It's courage. What a great superhero motivation, right? I think that he also, that builds to the multitude, which I thought would have gone with almost any other visual for it than the one that they went. But the way that story goes on an arc of, like, you think it's this living thing, and then you think it's this force of nature, and then it turns out to basically be the fifth dimensional version of a gun.
Right.
Like, it just fired through time. I think that arc is about as Morrison as it gets in the best possible way. And this Brainiac part perfectly sets that up for later in the story.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that moral quandary of, yes, it's pretty horrific to be shrinking a city, Metropolis in particular, and yanking it from this planet. But if what's behind it is destruction is coming and we're preserving significant artifacts, as Brainiac says, like you said, it's at least something for Superman to wrestle with. Obviously, it's going to be an easy answer, and he'll prevail in the end. When we get to 23.2, they do simplify it a bit, because now there's this business that Brainiac himself will destroy these worlds that the multitude is coming for, to deny the multitude its prize, but also because he relishes in it. So I feel like it gets a bit simpler when we get to that. And we really quickly revert back to the Geoff Johns iteration, where he's Coluan scientist, Vril Dox, and he's been experimenting on his son, and he's brought before the tribunal for charges, and he's exiled. Right. But his whole thing, just like we saw in the Action Comics arc, is preparing for the coming of the multitude. But then he creates the traditional trappings of Brainiac with the skull ship and these different forms that he will inhabit, these different probes, like the caterpillar form. So we get now very close to where we had been before, for better or worse. I don't know, absent Morrison specifically telling the stories, maybe it's for the best that we kind of circled back to the Johns version.
It is. I mean, it's not 23.2. I have some resentment for it. Just, it's not a bad comic, and it's a good version of Brainiac coming back. My issue is not with the content itself. It's just, at the time, it felt so petty. Like, Morrison had just quit. And you also have, like, in the Superman books at that time, they get handed over to Scott Lobdell, and it just became very clear that somebody at the top went, everything that was in the Morrison version we just did, take all that apart, put it back in the box, mail it back to the manufacturer. We don't want it anymore. We want, and this felt like a symptom of it. But I do think that like we said before, this is a better quintessential Brainiac than the New 52 version is. The New 52 version works great for the story it's telling, but you can't necessarily hand that to somebody and then them watch Super Friends and have any idea what is going on. Whereas the Geoff Johns Brainiac, and the one that comes back in 23.2, you're going to wonder where his pants went, but everything else is going to check out just fine.
Yeah, there is one angle that's included in 23.2 that I really I appreciated. I thought it was intriguing, was the parallel that Brainiac sees between himself and Jor-El, right? Because Brainiac is warning of this threat that is real, of the multitude, right? He might not be aware of the exact true nature of what it is, like that we'll come to learn in the Morrison run. But he is warning of this threat, and no one is taking his warnings to heart, and instead he is exiled for it. I mean, justifiably experimenting on his son and whoever knows, who knows what else. But still, like, he's issuing these warnings that are not being heeded. And so he sees Jor-El going through something very similar on his planet, and bottles candor, as we know in the story, and then learns, though, that Jor-El was able to turn back the multitude. But by the time Brainiac returns to investigate, the planet has died of natural causes. But I don't know. I just thought that the parallels between Jor-El and Brainiac, not something that I would typically expect, but I don't know. It was intriguing to me.
No, I would love to actually to see that part of 23.2. I would love to see another writer scoop up and do something with. There's nothing better than when a hero and a villain have parallels and then one stark moral diversion. And that the difference of Jor-El will put only his son in a rocket, use the life raft for just to make sure his boy is okay, versus Brainiac trying to sew an egg beater into his kid when no one's looking. Like, is such a perfect diversion that you could do a whole comic story just about that. Just that's the payoff moment at the end, and someone should.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things. Yeah, obviously the experimentation on his son, we can't get past that. And then on top of it, like we said, this story pins on Brainiac the idea that he is destroying these planets to deny the multitude, and because he relishes in it. So we have a very clear line of demarcation between him and Jor-El, but a little bit of that connective tissue there, which is interesting. Now, we did not read or reread the Doomed event, but Brainiac did figure into that. That's the storyline where Superman becomes infected with the Doomsday virus and mutates into a Doomsday-like creature. But Brainiac was involved in that. But that does kind of launch us into the final storyline of the New 52, Convergence, which to this day, I have still not read in its entirety, nor do I ever really expect to. I read the first and last issue of the main series and very, very quickly skimmed through the rest. Have you read the whole thing?
No, Convergence is the comic book version of the tax code. You buy 3 different versions. It has 3 different lengths. No one agrees on how many words are actually in it. No one's actually read the whole thing. I don't believe it. If someone told me they've read all of Convergence, they're going to have to show me like video of them sitting doing it, or I'm not buying it.
I mean,
and I love Dan Jurgens, but
there's someone out there. I mean, just for a quick backstory, this was 2-month long event comprised of that main 8-issue miniseries and then a whole bunch of these 2-issue miniseries, and it was meant to fill in during the time when DC was moving offices from New York to California. So they needed something to plug in there, and that's what we got. And as far as the Brainiac side of it all, which is what we're most interested in here, the Brainiac in this story is essentially this godlike being. We find out that this is my reading of it. Tell me if this lines up with your understanding. Again, I didn't study this, but essentially, he started as the pre-Flashpoint version of Brainiac, essentially this post-Infinite Crisis Brainiac we've been talking about. He survived the Flashpoint and then continued to investigate the cosmos further and ventured beyond the source wall, right, and became this more godlike Brainiac. So if our Brainiac, so to speak, was bottling cities from individual worlds, and he had these different probes that existed in different forms, this godlike Convergence Brainiac was bottling realities from different universes and also had probes, so to speak, or different aspects in the form of the Brainiacs of each of those realities. That's my take on this. So it's the basic concept of Brainiac, but instead of a city and worldwide level, it's a reality and universe level.
Yeah, just put it on the Spinal Tap knob. Just turned it up another to 11.
Yeah.
The only thing I think you left out is that Brainiac has another Brainiac that changes his name to Telos halfway through. And unfortunately, I skipped Intro to Convergence at college, so I will never know what is going on with that.
Well, I think that's the embodiment of the planet that he was housing all of these realities on, or something like that.
Because it turned in at least one of them, that thing keeps flickering into 30 different Brainiacs.
Okay.
I get, but I don't know.
I don't
and
know.
no one
Yeah,
does.
it's one of those things more just to kind of note it. And I guess at least what we can glom onto here is that as far as another interpretation of the character as this more godlike being, although by the end of the story, he's divested himself of this energy and allows him, I guess, to return to a more typical form. Well, that leads us into the Rebirth era. And I guess if we're going, if we're saying that there's only so much to say about the Convergence side of things, I suppose similarly, we have some play for Brainiac in the Rebirth era in Justice League No Justice, and then in the Scott Snyder run of the main Justice League title. Now, I have read all of that when we went through the metal and death metal events, and no disrespect to the folks involved, but like once was kind of enough for me. But I did, for purposes of this episode, I reread No Justice #1 and Justice League #18, which were fairly Brainiac centric. And specifically with No Justice, there's this business about Brainiac enlisting the Justice League's help against the Omega Titans, who are essentially going to bring about the destruction of Kolu. And Brainiac is killed or seemingly killed for a brief period of time before his inevitable return through the machinations of Amanda Waller and her use of the psychics of the DC universe. I guess what stood out to me, and I welcome any thoughts you have on this, is just the idea of Brainiac asking for help.
It does stand out, but then it also stands out within the context of the reading. I love Scott Snyder's Batman, his New 52 run of Batman. But this period of Scott Snyder's writing forward, I have such a hard time with, because the internal consistency of storytelling goes completely out the window, to the point that you have stuff like Brainiac gathers up all these heroes in No Justice because he needs help, and then he gets blown up, and then the same writer in the next leg of this story in the Justice League comic, Lex Luthor puts his head back together and Brainiac jumps up off the table and goes, "I'm not helping anybody ever." And it's like, what? Why not? Didn't you just give everybody glowing pajamas to do exactly what Lex is trying to do? But Scott didn't at that time need another like Galactus knockoff to need Brainiac. So that was the issue, I think, with that. I like Scott Snyder's writing outside of this node, but this all this metal stuff is like trying to follow a spaghetti noodle back through the bowl to me.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, we did episodes on it a while back. I was not going to delve through all of that material again, but just to note that Brainiac was involved here. And like I said, this aspect of him asking for help, I did not ask you to read this, but have you read Superman Space Age?
Yes.
The Mark Russell, Mike Allred story from 2022.
Same idea, much more effective.
Yeah, I mean, not a huge role for Brainiac, but an effective one, where similar type of idea. He is still visiting worlds and essentially stripping them of all of their valuable resources, but it's to prepare for the battle against the Anti-Monitor, because that's what's hanging over all of Superman Space Age. This out of continuity storyline, but just real quick, is that the Superman has been warned about the impending end of everything, right? And so that's hanging over the proceedings. And you have Brainiac functioning in a similar way generally, but behind it is the fact that he's trying to prepare to stop the Anti-Monitor and is essentially there to present himself as an ally, right? And of course, Superman doesn't go along with Brainiac, but I just wanted to mention it because I guess that was something that I saw a little bit of a little parallel there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, my favorite thing about Space Age is, I mean, it is sort of out of continuity, but it's kind of from the perspective of a world that never got the spotlight during Crisis on Infinite Earths, you know, and how tragic it would be to be the Superman of one of these worlds that just got eaten before you ever had a chance to do anything about it or take any action, which is, you know, how natural disasters strike in real life. Is, you know, very rarely does an earthquake go, "Hey, next Thursday, you know, board everything up," you know, like, so that was a really fascinating part of it. And the fact that in the ruins of that universe, Superman and Brainiac become strange bedfellows. I thought that was really interesting.
I'm a parent, which means that a family-friendly comic shop is a must, and there's none better than Aw Yeah Comics. Visit one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. Follow them on social media and at awyeahcomics.com for news about signings, live sales, and much more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. My comic shop closed over a decade ago, but if there's one place where I feel that same sense of camaraderie, it's Fat Moose Comics, New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store, led by current owner Sean Hendricks. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany, New Jersey, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. As a movie lover and independent filmmaker myself, I appreciate the importance of great, well-run film festivals, and one family of fests has you covered in New York and New Jersey. Don't miss Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Round Reel in Bloomfield, and Shorts and Stout in Long Beach. Event details, as well as submission information for filmmakers, can be found at filmfreeway.com. This was another one I didn't ask you to take a look at, but I did just want to note the Superman 78 miniseries by Venditti and Wilfredo Torres, set in the style and continuity of the first 2 Richard Donner Superman movies. And that came out a year before Space Age in 2021. And it's funny because you read it and it definitely feels like, yes, this could have been a Superman movie during the Donner era of the films, but it also feels very much informed by the Geoff Johns take that we started this episode with, because that's very much the Brainiac you get here. He started as a Coluan. There's a flashback to his world decimated, right, as he's taking all of this in. And then it turns out he built this body for himself, this android body that he's able to project his consciousness into. He's got the skull ship. It's maybe he's slightly less malevolent in this story in that, unless I'm really misremembering, he wasn't actively destroying planets. Like, he bottled Kandor right before Krypton was destroyed, like this small act of preservation before the planet met its end. And even as he prepares to bottle Metropolis, I don't know that the next step is necessarily the destruction of Earth, but rather he's identified Superman there on the planet Earth as this contaminant.
Yeah, he doesn't belong.
He doesn't belong. Yeah. So it was just interesting, and not unlike that Unbound movie, we do get Superman now placed in the bottle city of Kandor, where he reunites with his parents, which was the one aspect of that miniseries I really didn't care for. I didn't like the idea that Jor-El and Lara had survived. That was a bridge too far. But it's funny because we talked about the Superman Reborn, the unmade 5th Christopher Reeve film. And that too, very, very similar type of story where Superman ends up in the bottle city of Kandor and has to escape and has this battle with Brainiac.
Yeah.
Obviously, that script had a different take on Brainiac. We've joked about horny Brainiac in that. And he had absorbed everything that he learned about Earth culture came from watching television, and he'd be spouting these TV catchphrases, and he was fascinated with Earth culture and really had these romantic feelings towards Lois. It was a take that I don't think would have worked particularly well. No. But as far as Brainiac being a villain and Superman being in the bottle city of Kandor and having this experience with the Kryptonian side of his life, again, just something that you see in that unmade script and in this story that was kind of meant to be part of that Donner world.
Yeah, I do. I think Venditti is probably the most underrated modern comic book writer. The books by him, if anybody's listening to this and wants what I feel like is his best stuff, it's this Superman stuff, with the exception of the Jor-El and Lara thing. That does actually ruin the first one for me a little bit. But the second one I think is the best Metallo story maybe ever. Love Gavin Guidry's art. Exo Man-O-War and for Valiant by Venditti is amazing. And Freedom Fighters by Venditti is such an untouched gem. But that notion of Superman being a contaminant, it's not an unvalid opinion of like, you could sneeze and kill this continent. You can't be here. That was the most compelling part of it to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. Like, whether it's Brainiac targeting worlds that are marked for destruction by the multitude or seeking out so-called contaminants. Like, again, I think they're just interesting spins that you can put on why particular worlds are being targeted. So I just wanted to mention that. And then this brings us almost at the present. We're at House of Brainiac here. We still have a couple of multimedia adaptations that we'll hit on, but House of Brainiac from 2024, this Joshua Williamson written story. Obviously, we've talked about it before, but what stands out to you about this?
This is probably the most negative I'm going to be on anything today.
Okay, it's all right.
I only liked this okay when I read it, but my favorite part of it was Lex Luthor's sacrifice, and that leading Superman and Lex Luthor into an era where they were allies. I've heard you talk about this on the show a lot. I thought this was a great opportunity to try that. And then that ultimately ended up, instead of that happening, Superman never trusts him. And he gets all his memories back in a special, and now he's just Lex Luthor again. I was so excited. I have this complaint. I like Joshua Williams a lot, but I find myself with a lot of his writing feeling like I finish his books, I think about everything that happened in them, and I like the overall story more than I enjoyed the act of reading it. I think that if he has he has a lot of great ideas that don't always come to the fruition that I want them to. And this is, when this story got announced of all the Brainiacs are coming together, I was so excited. And what this really turns into is they're not really any different than the Brainiac drones in any story. I wanted to see the differences in the personalities of Milton Fine and Brainiac 13, and like that they're all this one guy, but each of these drones is colored by their life experiences coming together. And you read a comment by me off on the show one time about the entire National Superman League fighting just Metallo that is modern Superman family in comics. And when this story got announced, I went, oh man, this is a threat that's worth bringing a 15-man Superman team. You could just about pair each of them off with a version of Brainiac, right? And that's how I would have done it, is, fill in issues that are Superboy versus Milton Fine, or, Keenan Kong versus, the Silver Age Brainiac. Put mashes together that you've never seen before, but that's not what we got. Like I said, all of the previous versions of Brainiac are basically shelved for this Brainiac Queen, who largely doesn't speak, and then going into absolute power basically gets shelved just as soon as she starts to develop her own personality. And then, as the astute Dr. DeVoe very succinctly broke down all of the Lobo problems in this, and I'm not as big of a Lobo fan as him, but they were glaring. I think Joshua Williams puts himself into trouble sometimes because he'll do an interview where he talks about what a big fan he is of a character, like he did with Lobo before this, and he just did it with it. This just happened, I noticed, with Legion fans too. He talked about what a big Legion fan he was, and how everybody should check out this new Legion crossover, and then they all die off panel. And so I constantly find myself not as satisfied as I would like to be, because I really do think he's a great writer. There's just, I think, maybe is a difference between expectation and what comes across. And I think this is the story of his. I really like his Superman run, but I think this is the story of it that suffers from that the most. It is just not what it pitched itself as. And what it pitched itself as drastically distracts from what it is, even in the story that you get, because you don't get enough time with the Brainiac Queen, and you don't get enough time with these returned Logo people, and you don't get enough time with any specific Brainiac, and you don't really get enough time with Superman.
All right, fair. So we'll unpack this a bit. So this storyline, the gist of it is power, right? Like knowledge is power, therefore power equals knowledge. And Brainiac has identified this hole in his programming that he can't reconcile, and comes up with this plot to call in all of these other versions of Brainiac, as well as to recruit the quote unquote House of Lobo as well. And they abduct the Superman family from Metropolis. It's all about acquiring this power. Essentially, I guess the answer that Brainiac has come to as far as this hole in his knowledge is to create this Brainiac Queen. Now, as far as what the hole in his knowledge actually is, I guess we get various theories on it throughout the story. I think what most characters identify is that it's so obvious, like it's family. That's what Brainiac is missing. I think when we get to the end of it, I mean, I don't know that it's spelled out exactly, but I guess family is the core idea, but maybe legacy even more so. Because at the very end of the story, when Brainiac's talking to Superman as everything's falling apart, he's talking about how he realized like everything eventually ends, right? And there was this idea of kind of leaving something behind. So I guess family, legacy, maybe would be what Brainiac had been missing. And there is a flashback to when he had originally gone to Lobo's world, and he was watching everybody kind of dealing with the catastrophe, and a father trying to protect his child, even though nothing would really be able to save them. And it caused that Brainiac in the past to have this moment of hesitation. He recalled his own family. I liked that aspect because it's like, okay, if we're going to have this business where he was once a person on Kolu and he had this family, well, what does that mean? Does that inform his presence? Does it come back in any way? So I kind of like that aspect of it. To your point, though, I don't disagree. I think if we're going to bring in all these different Brainiacs, yeah, I think it would have been interesting. It does feel like a bit of a missed opportunity to not have more play for them as individuals, especially the ones we had spent time with, like the Milton Fine version or the pre-Crisis iteration or the Superman the Animated Series version. I think the closest we get is Brainiac 13, because there's that whole bit where Lex and Lena go into the mainframe or whatever it is to try to sort everything out, and Brainiac 13 is in there and talking about how Lex had sacrificed Lena to him and all of that. So I feel like that's the closest that we get. But yeah, I definitely would have liked to have seen more of that. I don't disagree with you on that front.
Yeah. And it's one of those. I hope if Josh Williams is listening to this, I had some pretty harsh criticisms, but I am a big fan, like especially of the Superman stuff he has right now, and it is that it's kind of the same thing with Geoff Johns that I talked about at the top of this. The first Brainiac story hurt me so bad as a seventh grader because I was such a big Geoff Johns fan, and it's the same thing with this Williams run. It was only how excited I was about his take on this that led, I think, to me feeling as sour as I do about it. But yeah, and I don't know that you can really do it again. I don't know that you can circle back and go, it's the other House of Brainiac and do the other story.
That's an interesting question, because what I was going to say kind of in defense of Williamson is that we had all of this talk starting with the Geoff Johns arc about how all of these other Brainiacs Superman has encountered, they existed, right? They were aspects of the real Brainiac. They weren't the real one, but we didn't have them come together. So what we got here, I guess, maybe a generous reading that I'll give is, it's like, okay, at least we're now seeing something that there was the potential for, like them all kind of being together. Now, to your point, it's like, now that we've done that, yeah, how likely are we to get that again? Fair. I don't know. Maybe the answer is not. I guess optimistically, it's like, okay, well, now maybe the next time we're in a similar type of situation, maybe there will be more space to actually delve into the actual individual Brainiacs and I don't know, tension between, like, who knows? Like, there are different ways that you could spin it. So yeah, I hope we get another bite at that apple, because I would like to see something like that.
Well, and you have, and this is the dweebiest part of my complaint, but like I said, I'm a big Brainiac 13 fan. you have so many Brainiacs on this ship where you have the trappings of them. But like when I read the JOHNS Brainiac, I did not assume that Brainiac 13 was a drone because of, frankly, Brainiac 13's power level in comparison to the other Brainiacs. But also, he's from the far future. So to me, I had interpreted that as, all right, well, Brainiac 13 is this core Brainiac further down the timeline. But then you come into this and you have Brainiac 13 standing there, but he doesn't seem to have any of Brainiac 13's stuff. He doesn't have War World. He doesn't have his technology reaffirming powers. He just has his hentai backpack and nothing else. Like, and I don't know. Milton Fine is in a similar boat. You don't see Milton Fine use any psychic powers in this, or as we now know, he's a balloon full of nanites. Doesn't shoot nanites at anybody. So, you know, or anything like that. And so it's a story that raises, and I think modern DC has this problem a lot. They're so into their Easter eggs that they don't think about the ramifications of what that Easter egg necessarily means. If Brainiac 13 is standing there, you've got to take a second and make that make sense. Or it's for it to hit, like, I'm the target audience. Putting Brainiac 13 in that comic, that's for me. I assume it's for you. I know you're a big Loeb Kelly fan. It's for you as well. Like, so the people who have a connection to it are going to go, well, this isn't the character I really know. He's just standing there. And the people who don't have a connection to it, doesn't matter to them one way or another. They're going to go, well, that Brainiac's buff, but they don't have any like feeling past that. And I think that as line wide, DC needs to assess that, because this is not the only comic that's doing that, right. Especially not with DCKO. God, I could rant about that for an hour.
It's funny. I feel like when I was talking to DeVoe about Lobo, I mean, it's like, I get it. And on the note of Brainiac 13 in particular, I mean, I feel like that's a choice, because there could have been a carve out for Brainiac 13 because of the future aspect. But, you know, clearly they drew this line in the sand, right? Of everything that had come before Brainiac wise, just an aspect, a manifestation. And then we get it here. I guess, I mean, I don't know how to put it, like, because as you're saying it, it's like you would think this was something that would bother me as well for the same reasons. But I guess maybe I land on the side of for JOHNS initially, and then any of these subsequent stories, you know, right up to House of Brainiac, like they really could have just swept away the other Brainiacs entirely in some way, shape, or form. And Mike, especially in the post Infinite Crisis era, right? The continuity that had existed, you know, before Infinite Crisis was still generally intact, yet we had just come out of a crisis. They could have made it that Superman never met Brainiac before. And this is the first time he's encountered anyone named Brainiac. But they did make this attempt to account for the Milton Fine version. And so similarly here, I guess I feel like, yeah, we could have just never seen Brainiac 13 ever again. It would have been cool if he's here and he's maybe has more of the trappings of the Brainiac 13 that we know, but we could have just never seen him at all. This middle ground, I guess I could kind of live with. But at the same time, if you feel like, well, just throwing them in doesn't do anyone any favors, I get that too. I mean, like, I do understand. It didn't bother me in that way, but I get what you're saying. Now, on the comic book front, there's one more final iteration of Brainiac to mention, which is the Absolute Superman version of Brainiac from this past year. Now, we have a whole episode on Absolute Superman coming up, so we'll be getting into it a lot more. But this version of Brainiac, who starts off as this laborer who is shoveling destroyed, deceased Brainiacs into this liquidator device, what's your take on that Brainiac?
So this is a very divisive comic among Superman fans that I have noticed reading through comments and stuff. But I think that the core conceit of the Absolute Universe seems to be, because this is a world where Darkseid is God, this seems to be a world where any character that has ever been a problem for Darkseid is subtly neutered, or attempted to be. They are deprived of their one core thing that people associate with him. You got a Batman with no fortune, a Superman with no human raising, a Diana with no Paradise Island, a Martian Manhunter with no booty shorts. You know, all the things that you most often associate with their power. And so this Brainiac to me is a perfect expression of that, because Darkseid has this is a Brainiac that has been reduced down to one drone, the butter shoveling robot from Rick and Morty of Brainiac drones, and still that's very intelligent. He still has access to all the Brainiac intelligence, but his lab is a ruin. He's fallen apart. And I get why people don't like it, but I think I love it, because it turns him into this very desperate, very dirty version of Brainiac that is terrifying. He's gonna operate on you like Brainiac is, but he's not good at it. So you don't know that you're gonna come out of it okay.
Yeah, just that kind of whole social class angle of it, and the body horror, an intriguing take. I guess my question, not to split hairs, but this Brainiac, when we start the flashback, he's sort of activated, right? And told that he's this laborer and this is his job. I mean, is this an artificial life form that has some organic components? Like, do we know the exact makeup of this Brainiac?
Well, I think the line between machine and organic for Brainiac, to me, is best when it's vague.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, we don't know where we came from. We do know that we are electrically wired. We have a fuel tank, at least some pneumatic components. We have a lot in common with a vacuum cleaner when you get down to it. We just know where the vacuum cleaner came from, so we've put a buffer there. So there's a fair argument that I would love to have Brainiac in a comic. Somebody go, "You're a machine," and he goes, "You're a machine. You just don't know it." You know, like, I think that there's a lot to be mined there. So I think that vagueness is there on purpose. I really think Jason Aaron, as you see his repaired body get more and more ersatz, I guess is the best word for it. I think Jason Aaron is intentionally playing with that. He starts off looking very biological, and then by the time Superman meets him, he's this horrifying. I mean, I was about to say Frankenstein, but actually Frankenstein is much more symmetrical than this guy ends up.
So we'll have a lot more to say about an Absolute Superman series not too long from now, but I wanted to at least hit on it here. Again, for the most part, we've been focusing on the in-continuity interpretations of Superman, but as far as something like Absolute or Superman 78 or Space Age, I did want to mention them, especially given how recent they are and how they tie into what we're talking about. And then in other media, in 2018, we get SyFy's KRYPTON, which we've talked about a lot in the past. I mean, this remains to me the gold standard of Brainiac on screen, and certainly in live action. We've had exceedingly few instances of that, not to knock the James Marsters iteration from Smallville, but from a visual perspective, I don't know how much more you could ask for than what SyFy's KRYPTON provides. And like I said, we did 2 whole episodes on this a while back, so I don't want to get too in the weeds with this. And I know you have not seen the series, but you did watch some clips, you said, right?
No, but I am going to watch it now, because leading into this episode, I watched a compilation of Brainiac scenes, and I watched the first half and then I stopped because I was like, okay, I'm going to watch this. I mean, you could definitely, I don't think you could do Brainiac better. Especially not for the budget that they have. Just the perfect, visually exactly what I'm going to look like. The right level of scary, the right level of power, but I was impressed with the budget that it seems to have gone into it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great show. I think an underrated gem that a lot of folks haven't seen. I hadn't seen it until a couple of years ago. It's well worth the watch. It's only 2 seasons, 20 episodes total. But as far as the Brainiac piece, he's the green-skinned Coluan with the skull ship. In this iteration, he was responsible for the death of his race on the planet Colu. Again, I don't want to spoil too much since you're going to watch it, but I guess a key aspect of this here is that he does have the ability to, I don't know, for lack of a better description, project his consciousness, and he takes over the religious figure on the planet, the voice of Ra. So he's puppeteering this voice of Rao, and then at a certain point is able to sort of form his true body on the planet and reveal himself. And then a key part of his storyline in season 2, again, without spoiling too much for you, is sort of his place in the mind of our protagonist, Seg El, and sort of that battle of wills between the two of them. So, like I said, I definitely recommend watching it. But from a visual perspective, it's so effective. And this whole idea of kind of taking control of someone before making his true physical presence known, like I wonder if that's something that James Gunn will tap into, right? Because all this business about projecting his consciousness into different probes and robots and things like that, we'll probably see that too, I guess. But as far as kind of this advanced scout, whether it's a Milton Fine or somebody else, I feel like that's an idea that we might see get some play.
I think so. I mean, it's very Milton Fine. That's exactly what I was about to say. Is that it's an interesting way to loop that aspect of Brainiac's history back in. And I like Brainiac with psychic powers. I think, no, I don't want him to only have the psychic powers, but I think that that's something you can put in his arsenal in addition to the force fields that is very difficult for Superman to contend with and just people to contend with. But I can very, very easily see James Gunn doing that. I think that we are probably, we're probably going to see a lot, though, of the Geoff Johns. For one thing, James Gunn is pulling a lot from post-Infinite Crisis, pre-New 52 continuity. If you had asked me where the DCU was going to pull from the most, I would have been shocked by how much is coming out of that window.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting question for sure. But the actor on Krypton, Blake Ritson, great performance, amazing voice, even with whatever alterations there might have been. There was like a creepiness to this Brainiac. I mean, I remember watching this for the first time a couple of years ago, like not knowing exactly where we were going with this. And when that body first formed, I mean, it'd be too far to say like, oh, I was scared watching it, but it was definitely like, it was creepy. So yeah, I mean, such an effective depiction of the character on Krypton. And yeah, I mean, if Gunn is looking at past iterations, I definitely hope he's taking a look, because I think they set the bar very high. I know I keep saying that every episode, but part of it is we don't have much to look at when it comes to live action Brainiac. Yeah. And even on something like Smallville, you know, we didn't have that traditional form. I know as I'm saying this, people are probably typing to point out like Brainiac 5 on Supergirl. Sure. You know, I don't want to take away from that. I also, Brainiac 5 is his own character. That's his own thing. But yes, we have had, you know, kind of something that's akin to that. But yeah, SyFy's Krypton, I highly recommend. And then most recently, this past year, season 5 of the Harley Quinn animated series on HBO Max. Now, you were telling me off mic, you're not a huge fan of this cartoon.
I find it crass. I'll end it there.
Okay. It's not that. I hear you. It's funny because it's the sort of thing I don't know that the audience would typically assume like, oh, Anthony must be a big fan of that, but I love it. I've had a lot of fun with it over these seasons. From the jump, when they showed the poster, you know, they announced that the setting was shifting to Metropolis, that Harley and Ivy were going to set up shop in Metropolis. And sure enough, they did. And Brainiac was generally our main antagonist for the season, although, spoiler alert, Lena Luthor ultimately emerges as the true villain of the piece.
I got that vibe from the episode.
Yeah, very much so. But the one that we specifically honed in on here is called Breaking Brainiac, and it's season 5, episode 4, and that's where we get Brainiac's backstory. And I mean, the long and short of it is that we have a Brainiac whose origins are on the planet Kolu, and he has a family, he has a wife, and he has his son, Vildox II. They are fully robots in this iteration, although with more personality than you would typically expect, and a home life where the wife is coming up with these sort of like chemical dinners that they're consuming as fuel for themselves. And all that. I mean, there are sex jokes, right? There's business about them, quote unquote, exchanging files, right? Yeah. And they put their heads together and he's like, I'm satiated. And she's like, well, I'll take care of myself. It's that, you know, it's that kind of vibe. But it takes a very tragic turn where Brainiac or Vril, right? He's gotten this promotion, but he's got one last task, one more trip to another world to visit, to acquire actually their shrinking ray. And when he comes back, this calamity has befallen Kolu, and everybody is dead, including his wife and child. And there's this whole idea that this is a race in pursuit of perfection. And on the planet Kolu, they had achieved 99% perfection, but there was this 1%. And I guess the idea takes root that it's that 1% of imperfection that resulted in the destruction of the planet and the loss of his family. And so then this sets Brainiac on this quest to go from world to world in his skull ship and find and bottle cities that are close to perfection, and through the use of his technology in the form of these automatons, allow them to achieve that perfection and then bottle the city. And he's initially accompanied by Coco, cute monkey-like space alien.
This is my favorite part of the episode.
But yeah, take it from there. Go for it.
I enjoyed this episode more than I enjoyed what I had of the first season. But the payoff with, you have Coco around being cute little Coco like he was in the Silver Age, and then when someone else comes on the ship and you get a different POV, you realize that Coco is a pile of bones laying next to Brainiac's chair, and that hit me like a ton of bricks. That was my favorite thing in the whole episode. I did actually enjoy the. Are you familiar with a cartoonist named Noah Pyle?
No.
If you're on Facebook at all, I'm sure you've seen his comic strips. They're aliens kind of over-explaining human activity. They have little blue heads. They were everywhere for a minute. I felt like the first part of this episode very much pulled on his kind of setups, like the way that they spoke, the situations that they were finding themselves in. They were pulled straight out of Noah Pyle cartoons. And I really liked the sense of humor in that part. I basically, once HARLEY and Poison Ivy came into the episode, it became a combination of a lot of screeching, and then also like the Brainiac masturbating at his monitor.
Yeah, he's watching the Coluans exchange files. Yeah,
right. I could have done without that. Sure, that kind of thing is where the show loses me. But I felt like the stuff with his family, particularly when he has the argument with his son, that was killing me. When he goes into his room to try to talk to him, and they have a very Vulcan father-son argument, and then a couple of really emotional moments that I felt like really landed really well, like the destruction of the planet and Coco. Yeah, I was watching it going, oh man, I'm really into this, until what the series is actually about came into the episode, and then I was like, maybe not.
So, the thrust of the season is that Brainiac has forged this alliance with Lena Luthor, and Brainiac is using his automatons to upgrade the city of Metropolis. I mean, it's in that sense, I felt at home. It felt like the City of Tomorrow Y2K art from the Loeb Kelly era. But the idea is that, once that city has achieved perfection, then it will be bottled, and Lena in the bottle will rule over everybody. That seems to be the deal that they have. Lena has welcomed HARLEY and Ivy to Metropolis with open arms, but they are these agents of chaos, and that goes against everything that Brainiac is about. So that's a big part of the conflict between Lena and Brainiac, is the presence of HARLEY and Ivy in the city of Metropolis. I don't want to spoil too much for people who might want to check out the season or the series, but I guess what I'll say is that I agree. I think the moments with his family are poignant, and there's sort of I guess maybe a bit of a vision that Brainiac has that I think was very moving as we get to the climax of the season. And also Brainiac does kind of learn what the point of all of this is. I mean, the final episode of the season is called "The Mess is the Point." And so Brainiac does have an arc. He has, that's maybe the biggest compliment that I can pay. I feel like this Brainiac, I don't want to make a broad sweeping statement and say this doesn't happen anywhere else, but all these stories that we're looking at, this might be the truest arc that the character goes through from the start of the season to the end. And we were hitting on this before, like with the business with the family. You go back to the New 52, like he's experimenting on Vril Dox, and that's fairly common across various iterations, right? There's this that, you know, this clone son, and he experiments on him and does all these terrible things. Here, I mean, this is arguably the most tragic iteration of a Brainiac story where he loses his family in this catastrophe. And like I said, I'm open as far as how much tragedy we want to infuse into his backstory, how much opportunity for redemption we want to infuse. I'm not going to go so far as to say like those elements have to be there, but I look at something like this and I don't know, I found it genuinely compelling.
No, I thought that was the best part, especially the 99% moment that you highlighted.
Yeah.
That is such a great nugget for a Brainiac origin. You know, something I was thinking about with the Silver Age episode too is you talked about that they give different names for where Brainiac is from at different times. There's Mega, and then I think you said Ramada was the comic strip character that was basically Brainiac.
Mm-hmm.
You could do something interesting with Brainiac where there was a Kaluan Vrildox, and he was the first one. But as this sort of collective has grown, maybe there was a guy on Mega who had a very similar arc, ended up in the same place, and then Brainiac found him and absorbed him in. And so that could be why these drones are so startlingly different, is they've all become the same thing, but they all have different ways. I mean, I just think I think that Geoff Johns accidentally created a brilliant thing that no one has mined yet, which is like all of these drones are Brainiac, but they all have these distinct lives, but they're all him. There's such a fascinating story. And again, I thought it was going to be House of Brainiac. There's such a fascinating story to be told there about people are different people at different times, right? There's a version of me that was swearing a lot, getting in fistfights at the parking lot when I worked at Logan's Roadhouse. And there's a version of me that taught Sunday school at one time. And there's a version of me that was in a Black Lives Matter rally. And there's a version of me that was in as many different places as you could be. And Brainiac gives you a chance to highlight, you know, all these different times in his life could meet and be very different people, but the same guy.
So, you know, it's funny as we wind down here, that's so interesting that you say that, because I feel like, and I hadn't really thought about this before, but when we look at the story that we started with, this Brainiac arc by Johns and Frank, you know, that was a way to introduce a quote unquote new version of the character without entirely discarding the versions that came before. And so we can say, well, they were aspects of the original, right? And so that's a way to kind of square all of this continuity. But to your point, there is also an arguably untapped opportunity that still exists, right? It can go beyond just saying, okay, no, those stories are still valid, but it's like, no, but you can actually tell a new kind of story with this setup and this type of Brainiac. Now, your point is well taken. I think there is an opportunity for something like that.
Well, and we had one of the ones we didn't talk about is Brainiac with an asterisk, is in Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps. The skull-headed Brainiac comes back having taken a knock to the head and is now separated from the rest of the Brainiac hive. And so he still thinks he's Brainiac, you know, and I think that I haven't got to read that all the way through yet. I just found out about it while we were researching for this episode, but again, written by Robert Venditti. So that's probably going to be my next stop. I'm very interested to hear, you know, what do you do when everybody's chanting, "I am Spartacus," and then one guy falls out and he still wants to be Spartacus, but he's not in the crowd anymore? You know, like, I think that's something that would be fun to read.
Yeah, no, right on. So to kind of close us out here, a couple of patron comments. Chase says, I like Brainiac's Kaluan form having a physical presence, like in the Geoff Johns story. I would also love if the Man of Tomorrow movie adapted that moment from the story where he pushes Brainiac's face into the dirt and says, "Welcome to Earth." You know, we were mentioning that before, how Brainiac hasn't been outside of his shell and he's so overwhelmed by the physical world around him. I agree with that. And then last but not least here, our pal Brian Dempsey, big picture question here. He said, first Brainiac stories I read were in the greatest Superman stories ever told, then Panic in the Sky and Dead Again, all with varying levels of quality in my opinion. Somewhere along the way, I was told Brainiac is one of Superman's top tier villains. I've basically accepted that as fact ever since. But is it in fact true? That is a question I hope you answer at the end of this deep dive. Has Brainiac earned his place as one of Superman's biggest villains, or has that title been applied due to his recurring villain status and not his actions? I mean, I would say the fact that I've devoted 4 episodes to this shows where I land on this. I do think he's earned that. I think I get what Brian is saying. Just because a villain has popped up over and over doesn't necessarily mean that they're one of the greatest. But at the same time, I do think there's something to be said for that longevity. I think if you're looking at periods of time in isolation, and I don't mean to keep beating up on like the Milton Fine iteration, but I think if you were looking at that totally in a vacuum, would that version of Brainiac be at the top of my Superman enemies list? No, probably not. But I think when we look at things like Superman the Animated Series and this Jeff Johns story and the Grant Morrison New 52 story, I think there's a lot there. And I think like I said, that cold logic and that bottling of candor. I mean, I keep coming back to that. I know we've had versions where that's not part of the story, but with versions where it is, I mean, I think that's something that's this really, really strong tie and this horror that was inflicted upon his world. I think there's something there. So for me, the answer is yes. I'll toss it to you.
No, and like I said, as a kid, I initially didn't like Brainiac. So I do understand the impulse that Brian has there. But I think that I think I said at the start of this that if Lex Luthor's Superman's arch nemesis, Brainiac is Nemesis 1A, right? In a world where there is no Lex Luthor, I think it is Brainiac. And I think that he brings something out of Superman that no other villain really does, which is that he outpowers and out-aliens him, which puts Superman in the position of not being the most fantastic or the most powerful or the most out there aspect of his story, and then forces him to deal with it. And also just forces Superman. The best supervillains are the ones in comic books, are the ones that bring something visually compelling out of their heroes. That's why Dr. Octopus shows up so much, right? Is Spider-Man in that cloud of arms. That's why, you can sit here and name villains for an hour like that. Batman and the Joker, right? The contrast between them. I don't know that any villain brings something visually out of Superman as much as Brainiac does. Because when Brainiac descends with his ship and his horde of bad guys and his intelligence, so he's not stupid. Superman has to use what's between his ears. He forces Superman more than any other villain to use every power that he has. And it creates incredibly dynamic visuals, and dynamic visuals are what we're doing here. So I think, Brian, that Brainiac earns his spot on Superman's Mount Rushmore and arguably has a spot on the supervillain Mount Rushmore.
Well, listen, anything else you want to say before we sign off here?
Just thank you so much for having me on. I love Brainiac, and I was really honored to get to come and talk about this chapter that I think is probably the best Brainiac leg. If you're looking at the character on an objective story quality level, I think that there are a lot more stories that I would recommend in this era, and a lot less instances of him stealing aluminum panels or whatever than there are in other eras.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think, like I said, this is where I land. This is where I think what I feel is the most compelling take on the character that has the most dimension to it and the most places to go. At the same time, as we say this, I think there are those who will push back and will cite the Kryptonian AI version from the DCAU and such. But that's what's been fun about going through this is really charting the evolution across time and media. So grateful to you and to Daniel and to Bernie and to Zach who joined me for all of these episodes, and to the audience who came along for this ride. I feel like we all have our advanced degrees in Brainiac lore. We're ready for the Man of Tomorrow movie. And as I keep saying, I'm not saying that we hit on every single incarnation, but we hit on a ton. And I think the most critical ones, and it'll be curious to see what this movie brings. And as we're watching it, what we might be able to kind of see the origin point from the comics or from other media. So it'll be really fun when the time comes. But this has been a blast. So thank you, Logan. I hope everyone checks out your podcast, Single Bound. Thank you, audience. Make sure you keep tuning in. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the show and receive exclusive content by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Rewards include our DCU spinoff podcast, advanced listens, sponsorship opportunities, and more. My sincere thanks to all patrons. Please rate and review the podcast via your platform of choice, subscribe so that you never miss an episode, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. By popular demand, Digging for Kryptonite merch is available at our TeePublic store. Visit the link in the show notes to get your DFK shirts, hats, mugs, and more. Flat Squirrel Podcast is also home to Lighting the Bat Signal, a Batman fan journey, which applies the signature Digging for Kryptonite approach to the Dark Knight, as well as another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, now in its final year covering the classic George Reeves series. Subscribe today. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Key art by Isaiah Simmons and theme music by Dan Pritchard.